Hey, everybody.
Hello.
How you doing?
Hey, good afternoon.
It's sunny in Italy.
Ah, that's nice. Been good weather in London until today. Now we're back to usual summer in London.
Here, yeah, I live in Amsterdam usually, so we share the same weather. Actually, when it's raining in London, 2 hours later, it's raining in Amsterdam.
Yeah, it's terrible weather here in the Netherlands now. We had some summer weather, but gone.
All right. So I'm sure that more people will join us, but as we're getting people in, I'm gonna add a link here, and I think I can pin it. I'm not up. We haven't updated our Zoom well enough. But I just sent the link to the doc that we're going to be chatting about, and I will add it again in another couple seconds as people join us. I've got some new faces, some returning faces. So what we're aiming for today is it's totally freeform. So normally when I'm here, I'm like, here's what we're talking about. I've got a schedule. Like, here's our meeting. That's not at all what this meeting is. This meeting is a total deep dive about a single topic that we can figure out what sort of where we should go, what order we should go in, what we should talk about, etc. Like it's our meeting to decide. Um, we did these when building the maturity model itself. Just going to add another link. We've had a few more journers, and they worked really well to hash out what our differences were or where we had friction points and where we didn't, because sometimes that's hard to suss out in Google comments, like how closely aligned are we, how much of this is like wordsmithing and how much of this is like something that we get to fundamentally challenge our own opinions on because of other people's perspectives and experiences and all those things, right? And that's what this is really good for. And then what we often did was break and allow for like thinking time and like implementation time of the things we talked about. So hey, we talked about this thing, let's try and write that down and see if when we write it down it's as much of a shared opinion as it was on the call. And then we figure out what the next cadence is that is useful to talk. So but I just wanted to give a bit of context because we have some people who haven't been in any of the deep dive calls before, what these are like, because I don't want you to think that there's any rules of the road or anything that you can or can't do. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say is welcome. So it might
Forgot
be
what this
worth.
was about.
You forgot what it was about.
Well, I thought we
Anything
just met
platforms working group,
recently, and I
David.
was confused.
Anything platforms working group, you just might as well show up. It'll be good time, right? That's basically what you're
Yeah.
saying. Cool. Yes. So the other context on this is we're about, I don't know, we sort of made up a timeline, Corbin and I, when we were talking. We're like, what would be nice? It would be nice if we could get this assessment to line up with some of the KubeCons, because that tends to get a lot of like visibility and a good like testing of the content we put out, because like lots of people start using and talking about it. So we thought if we can have a pretty good version of this going into Salt Lake City and a like official published version going into London, like we're in a really good shape. And maybe it falls slightly outside those windows, but that would be really good. With that in mind, we were hoping to sort of solidify some of the like how we want this thing to work in the next couple weeks so that we could start hammering out some of the details of like what is the actual content of the thing. So yeah, our goal sort of in these first couple weeks is sort of trying to figure out what shape questions we want to ask, how do we want people to interact with this thing so that when we start actually writing questions or writing the content behind the assessment, it's fitting into a mental model that we all have sort of put through its paces and agree would be beneficial to people. So that's all I got. Is that surprising to anyone? Any questions? Any hopes that I didn't talk about? Fears?
I have a question. I was curious. So I'm Corbin Pacheco. I'm a container specialist. I work at AWS. And I kind of brought forth this issue a while ago, and I think some of you folks were here when I originally presented it, and some of you folks probably were not. So I was wondering, like, how many people, maybe a show of hands, have read this doc so far? Okay,
Nice.
cool. So there's a good
Oh.
good percentage of folks. And I think so thank you, Abby, for queuing this one up. Maybe I'll just you know, kind of continue and talk a little bit about kind of where we are, and maybe answer some questions, and then we can get into some discussion around, I think, primarily the focus of this kind of first phase. If you take a look at the document, there was a few phases that we wanted to kind of walk through. And the first phase was kind of really around just like the format of this tool that's really very tightly oriented to the maturity white paper that we have. And it's more of like an assessment format. And I actually saw a recent piece of work around that somebody from the team's doing around platform as a product and interviewing product managers. That's kind of an interview format. So it's very similar to that in nature. And what we want to get out of this first phase is make sure that we have the right sort of format. So, you know, yes, no questions. It's kind of detailed here in the document. So if you go kind of halfway down, there's a section that says, the initial development phase, we're actively looking for community feedback in the following areas. The general approach, you know, taking a survey-based approach, using questions that are yes, no, as opposed to like other multiple choice or other formats that we might be familiar with when we're doing surveys. And then I think probably key to this discussion is this concept around risk. There was a bunch of feedback in the document. You know, is that the right concept to use? And then ideally, once you kind of go through this assessment, there'd be some sort of like guidance or some sort of inputs about, hey, how do I think about this particular area? And a lot of that's really covered by the white paper. So maybe I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions or comments at this point.
Yeah, I think Steve's got his hand up for a bit. I don't know if that's good.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right phase to start throwing thoughts in. Because like normally when you have an assessment like this, it's normally based on something like a model that's been researched. And so what you're doing is you're kind of asking similar questions to the research and then saying, based on the research, those answers probably mean that this is what you're experiencing, and this is what you can do about it. In this case, this is more of like a practitioner experience based model, because the maturity model that was created is like, this is our lived experience of it. So I feel that directly tying each question to either a score or an outcome probably won't work. I think the idea in principle will work, but what we would need to do is, like, taking question one as an example, if we say, do you have a dedicated team aligned to building the platform, and is it their main responsibility? If they say no to that, there would have to be like a sensing question that said, like, that detects whether or not the problem is there. So, for example, you'd need a follow-up question that then says, are you finding that the platform moves too slowly when you have needs, or that features don't get added, or, you know, like whatever the problem is that we think they'll get, so that you'd need to do it in two phases for each question. Because I think that's what we're preempting by saying that no is high risk. Because if it just so happened that they didn't have a dedicated team, but like the tech leads from every team were all like treating it like an inner source project and it was like flying along, then actually we could then shift on and focus our improvement suggestions on something else. That was the only thing that I felt with this style of model, is that we just need to, there's like, this is the detection question. Then there's one that just says, are they experiencing the problem we think this would probably cause, before we then say, we recommend that you would fix this. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, and I think so. I don't want to get too far ahead. So, it's great input. I think I want to hear more from you guys first, and then maybe I'll respond with some more information and some feedback as well. Does anyone else have any other comments?
I'm going to jump in just to say I've started taking notes right at the bottom of the page. I'm not sure if this is where the notes will live forever, but if you want to follow along and make sure I'm capturing what you're saying correctly, or you want to add to those notes at any time, feel free. That can be group notes. But that's all I want to say. So, William, I think you were next up with the hand.
Yes, thanks, Abby. Corbin, I'm not sure if you are the right person to direct this question, but it's more of a feeling. Setting risk in the score goes effectively against about what we say of the maturity model. I explain why. We say that and levels in the maturity model are not uh, um, milestones where an organization or a team or the effort should be. And it's not a competition or a target, right? Each level. It's just assessing if we are there or if you're not there. If we are scoring with something like risk, in the pure sense of risk, then we are saying that doing something opposite or not in line with what uh, the yes to the question is, it's a risk for that level or for the level that we want to reach. So I don't think risk is the appropriate model for this assessment.
Yeah, no, I think there's been a lot of feedback around using the concept of risk. And so I think that's going to be the source of this discussion today for sure is I think we want to figure out what the right terminology is. There's a couple other raised hands, so maybe I'll just keep collecting input at this phase. Who's next?
I think I'm next. Yeah, I was gonna say one of the main questions I have is if we decide risk is the right word, which I still kind of question, is who's the risk to? Is it the risk to the success of the platform? Is it risk to the success of the business? Is it risk to the end consumers of the platform? That was never really clear to me as to like who is the risk that we're trying to mitigate. Because I think the way you could answer the questions or go through the survey is like very different. I think somebody was talking about this in the chat too about how it feels like a lot of this too could be Dora based, and a lot of the Dora stuff, at least in terms of how we would approach the model or the questionnaire, a lot of the questions seem to be survey based, which I also don't know if I fully agree with. I think a lot of these can be measured through like quantitative facts. So for example, it's like if we were measuring a cloud platform, it's like how many deployments are your application teams doing to production every day, which could indicate the success of your platform being able to help teams successfully promote to production. I think there's other things that are probably more general of like, do you have a dedicated team to the platform that are, yes, no, but also very quantitative. I have some fears about trying to make this so like qualitative, because I don't think that'll work very well, is I think my thought on it. And then just in general, like I'm not sure risk, I think, to what William was saying, like I don't know if risk is really the right wording here. I think it's up to the business to decide if where you are at in the maturity model is a risk to the business or risk to the platform success for what the business needs.
Yeah, so the risk is really focused on risk to the platform initiative itself. And I do have like a couple of slides that I'll bring up in a couple minutes after collecting a couple more inputs. But I'll kind of walk you guys through the thinking there. But it's really around risk to the platform initiative itself. So it's not a risk to the platform. Like it's not a risk to the end users of the platform or a risk to the business in that regard. I mean, obviously there's going to be downstream impacts if something happens with the platform initiative, but it's not directly measuring like business impact in the sense of things like resiliency of the platform or the cost of the platform or things like that. And I think that's one of the things that was highlighted for me through this exercise is some of the stuff that we have in the white paper right now doesn't necessarily address some of the technology specific functionality of the platform in terms of like resiliency or some of the best practices you might have in those categories. So it is something that was kind of highlighted to me through this process and something that I want to try to shore up as part of this work.
I'm
So a
sorry. I know
couple
that there are. I'm sorry, David. I just want to say one thing. I'm hijacking your time, Corbin. I know that it's the risk. I could read it that the risk is can be associated to the aspect or the platform in general. But putting risk, just simply putting risk in there, will imply that any effort at level 1 provisional is red. It's risk.
Yeah, and it's you have to be careful just with terms. Whatever your intentions are with something, it will just it'll get out of your control. So what I put the stuff in about Dora because of the fact that it doesn't, if you do a survey like this and Dora doesn't go into rubrics, what it does is it tries to define high performing versus low performing and then says basically statistically it lines up with these kinds of behaviors. So I think we have to figure out like what is the outcome that this kind of assessment should result in. And I don't know that it's a good idea to go after an initiative because part of the point we're making about platforms is they're not initiatives. They're services that get built and changing the way of working and need to be a more continuous thing. So as vendors, we tend to come in and look at it as an initiative. But for companies, that's not a healthy thing because they end up in funding traps and management reporting misalignments and things like that, unless they're changing the way they work in order to align with the business. So to me, like a well-performing or not so well-performing platform does have business impacts. And, the guidance is more on how do you need to make improvements for the company or the organization, as it may be, and what are the areas that you want to look at, which is kind of what Dora does. It says, if you want to be high performing, look at these areas and figure out your next step based on, what high performing teams are doing versus what you're doing. And does it match up with your goals, right? Because also having a risk assessment kind of implies that there's one way to go about things, right? Which is not necessarily the case across organizations. It might not be appropriate. Even Dora is not necessarily totally appropriate for any kind of organization. So, and we've seen lots of people blindly adopting Dora or misinterpreting how to use it. So that's, I think we need a stronger statement of the outcome up at the top. And I am particularly opposed to like this idea of initiative based because that gets people into the wrong mindset immediately.
So I want to come back at you that one, David, because as a consumer, not a vendor in this group, we have an initiative. My platform is a product initiative. And so I hear what you're saying, but I'm coming at it from a customer perspective, and not everything can be done the way that the platform maturity model talks about it. The finance aspect is the hardest thing to change. We're in finance cycles, we're in a way of operating. The larger your organization, the harder it is to change that. And sometimes you have to start with an initiative that has its own funding, that is in one of those cycles, that's sponsored at an appropriate level, and that you can progress. And that's where I'm at the moment. We're not trying to do it enterprise-wide.
Do you have an end date in sight?
No, not at all.
That's not, I'm talking about project, right?
Yeah, so project is a very specific word, different to initiative.
But I associate initiative and project
right,
a little too much together, right?
Yeah, we associate initiative with journey, and I see this as a 5-year journey on how we transform and change. And we've aligned that to a value stream, and we've made it one of our big rocks. So this is where words have got special meaning, right? I was the next with my hand up, so I'm going to go anyway. I think, coming from a bank, do you like that, Marsh? I'm always good at that, aren't I? Coming from a bank, I don't like the word risk, right? We have risk frameworks, we have risk approach, we have risk appetite. Please choose a different word, because risk in our context, if I filled that in, that could get us in trouble, right? That's us almost saying that there's something wrong with what we're doing. And I think that was one of the points that William was trying to get out. There's actually nothing wrong with what you're doing. It's a viewpoint of where you're at, and how do we measure that, and how do we say that's good, that's maybe bad, you might want to do better. How do we encourage people to go from one to the other? So that was about my only feedback I wanted to give you today, Corbin. We did have this conversation in the round table in Paris. I think risk is just a really objective word. Is that right? I'm dyslexic, remember, so it's hard for me. It's one of those words that's just got a special meaning to some people. It presses our buttons. And I prefer...
it's a word that requires a bounded context in order to discuss it.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, David. Because the first thing popped in my head is, right, how are you quantifying that? What is the risk? What's the perceived risk there? Because maybe your perception is different to our perception or our experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's been like a super hard area in terms of how to actually apply that concept to these questions, right? There has to be some form of assessment, and that's one of the main reasons why I brought this to the community, is because there needs to be like some voice, like some communal voice that describes like, hey, what does this mean? If I don't have a product manager, what does this mean to me as an organization? Does it matter? Does it not matter? I don't know, right? And I think that's where, like, I think the experience of this broader team can add a lot of value in terms of developing this, is because everybody here has some experience and perspective on what that does mean for an organization, right? A lot of this is new. There's no real way of measuring it other than the collective experience of the journey that customers or organizations have been on trying to build platforms, and the emergence of some of these best practices out of that, right?
So you're talking about
I'm
the
not gonna.
opinion. You're talking about the opinion there, and I just want to throw back, because I know William's got his hand up next. But to that very point about if you don't have a product owner, well, William actually said it. I was watching William this morning from the platform Con Live. If you don't have a product owner, you're going to fail, right? That's a really good opinion. How do you take that opinion? How do you codify that into kind of your forum, right? Because that's really what you're talking about there.
That's right.
I'm cutting in for organizer-oriented, not risk-oriented conversation. I promise, William. I just want to present, as one of the leads of the working group, a huge thank you to Corbin for getting this conversation started and doing so openly. So there's a lot of good conversation going on right now that are challenging some of the ideas, and I'm super appreciative of the way people are challenging the ideas and the way that it's being handled. The only thing that I would just recommend is this isn't Corbin's anymore. I love you, Corbin. You've done a great job starting. But you are the champion. You are the proposer, and I am the champion coming from the leads. There'll be a lead associated with every big piece of work, just like this, just to help grease wheels and make sure people get what they need. But this is definitely an hour thing. So when we're talking, like, feel free to challenge each other, and it doesn't have to be that Corbin has an answer to everything. And I don't want you to, Corbin, to feel like you have to have an answer to everything either. So that's all I wanted to say. William, you are next.
Thanks. No, I know absolutely, Abby. That's a very good point, Corbin. At no point whatsoever we are challenging you. We're challenging a good idea to bring it forward. Absolutely. So Corbin. Okay. Now I think I would like to move on from the word risk. Right. We have all opinions about it. I would like to challenge the approach, which I would like to add something to it. So when we build platforms, we say that we build from developers, right? From the end users. So why don't we do the same thing with the assessment? So the assessment, and then correct me if I'm wrong. I'm saying Corbin, of course, because Corbin started it, but you started writing the assessment, basing your work on the maturity model. That's what I seem to understand, at least from the document. which is good. What if we coadjuvate or compensate this work with, and we take the platform out of the equation? So we are not evaluating, I don't think, so the maturity platform engineering maturity model doesn't evaluate a platform. It evaluates an organization or components within an organization, and it targets the maturity of those components. So why shouldn't the assessment do the same? Why shouldn't the assessment ask questions that are targeted to understand if the organization maturity is at level with the levels of the model, and then try to understand, all right, you are between here and here, and these are the items that are not putting you at level X or a level Y. So so what I mean by that is targeting questions to match to a level might not be an exercise that has a longer strategic intake. Whereas if we build up a questionnaire that is starting from where is an organization, how is the organization built, how is the organization addressing, let's say, the cloud spend, are the developer teams each one having their own landing zone, or all these little questions, these things that build up, all right, you know what, we have enough information to put you at between this and this level in the maturity model. Now, what is not putting you at level, let's say 3 instead of 2, is these particular items, which you can address with X, Y, Z. So if we would look into it at the questionnaire like this, then we are making something that is a little bit more dynamic and detached from the maturity model, which is, I think, better. I think that the maturity model itself has the questions that somebody can ask within their organizations already. What we are not bringing in, we should be bringing in with the assessment that you're proposing, I think, is ask those questions that are not necessarily in the maturity model already.
Yeah, so I guess just to kind of move a little bit forward, I see there's a couple hands raised, so I'll come back to those in just a second. I did want to share like kind of where I've been in this journey. So we talked about this in Paris. We had a couple meetings, I guess, leading up to this into this forum, and I had a few situations that I was dealing with in terms of customers that were asking these questions, right? Where are we? How are, can you come in? Can you assess like some best practices? And really the white paper was like the only industry tool that we have to help, an organization look at like, where are they, right? What are they doing? What are their challenges? What are some things that they should be doing? And so I work a lot with helping organizations build platform strategy or execute the strategy. And that's kind of where all this work sort of came from. And so I started this conversation with Abby, several months ago now, where we were talking about how would we build a tool that would help some organization to assess this, right? And so after building this initial document, one of my customers was asking like, hey, can you help us do this? And I said, well, I'm thinking about this idea. So I built kind of a prototype of what it would look like. And, and I told them, look, this is like just an idea conceptually that is in early development. And I'm trying to work with the community to build something like this. But, in absence of that, I have this like sort of framework, like, hey, can we go through this exercise? And they were open to it. And so I want to show you guys kind of what the output of that exercise looked like, so you can kind of get a little bit of a visual cue of like, hey, how would this work, right? And I think there was a lot of learnings that kind of happened as a result, right? And it touched on a lot of the feedback that you guys have given, which is risk the right idea? Is the format the right thing? Is yes and no the right answers? Like, you know, do people end up in a category at the end, right? After they go through this exercise, it kind of tested a lot of this stuff. Let me see if I can share and just kind of walk through a couple things that I
I
put
think it'd be
together.
good in response to this as well. I know a few other people have done things like this. I think we have a few people who are consultants on the call that have like done these things, and people who've done this internally to their organizations. So maybe we're sort of kicking off a phase of conversation, which is like, where have you tried doing this before, and what have you learned from it? And Corbin's kicking us off, and others can add to that maybe. Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, Corbin. Keep
So
going.
no, that's right on, right? I think there's tons of experience, which is why I really wanted to do this here and not just like off in some, you know, corner of AWS or something like that, right? So I use the term platform initiative, which I understand is another sort of, I think all the things that we're doing when we think about naming conventions or terminology is hard, right? Everybody knows if you've built a product, naming is probably the hardest part. So platform initiatives, they come and go. Really what I'm focused on is helping teams think about the longevity or resilience of their platform, right? So when we talk about platform as a product, it's really like, how is that product going to live on, right? And a lot of times, especially with platforms, I think some folks told me last time, they built platforms in the past. Those platforms have come, they've gone, they've moved on. They build new platforms, you know, and things like that. So part of it is helping people to make sure that those platforms live and helping them identify what are things that they need to be thinking about that will help them create resilience around the platform. And this is really, I would say, one of the things that I learned is about 99% of this is around the people and process aspect and less about the technology, right? And so there's a bunch of ways that we address the technology aspects, but that's it. I use the term risk, right?
Sorry, can you back, Corbin, just one sec?
Yeah.
Because I think there's an important aspect of that first bullet point. I think how you build software is constantly changing over time. And if you think of that as the platform, if you zoom out and look at how you build software, there are going to be pieces that come and go for sure, but that is going to change and evolve over time. It's going to change and evolve as your organization grows or shrinks. Like this is like maybe just my point here is that maybe our platform of our definition of platform is too narrow in scope. This is how you build software. If you think of that as the platform, then platforms don't come and go. It's just like, and back to, was it Chris's earlier point that, sometimes it requires an initiative in order to get the funding you need to get to the next level of energy, right? How do you boost the performance of the organization? How do you make the case for that investment so you can level up where you think it's appropriate in your platform? That's sorry if I derailed and interrupted your flow. I just think this is something we trip over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you in terms of how software is built, but I do think that there is this notion of like platform engineering itself results in a product. And sometimes if you don't have the right like organizational structure or whatever, like that thing could eventually crumble and like a new thing will be built somewhere else, right? Like, so I think, in general, I tend to see these patterns happen where, somebody builds a platform based on, in the past it was like an old orchestrator of the past. Now people build platforms on Kubernetes. Maybe there's a thing in the future they build platforms on that we don't even know about, right? Like, I think just the ecosystem and everything, continues to evolve. We talked a little bit about risk. I'm going to kind of move around that a little bit, but the idea is that it's well understood. Everybody can like conceptualize this notion of risk. There's a lot of questions around what it is. I think going through this exercise, the executive sponsor that I worked with who wanted us to come do this really appreciated this concept of risk because it was something that she, as the sponsor, could take to her leadership and say, hey, like these are some things that we need to work on, right? And it was well understood. Like, they didn't say the sky is falling. They said, hey, we've identified these categorically, and like we want to make some investment here, right? And when I say investment, it's not necessarily money, it's just investment of time and resources or whatever. And the second thing was it really sort of promoted action. So let me show you guys sort of the output. So the survey right now is based on the 5 categories that exist in the maturity model, right? So we have investment, adoption, interfaces, operations, and measurement. In each category, there's a series of questions, and there's a differing number of questions based on each category today. Now, like I said, this was just like a pilot exercise, doesn't really mean anything. I could throw all the questions away and start over at this point. It wouldn't matter. But this was just an exercise to see, is this going to be useful? Each question had a low risk, a medium risk, and a high risk associated with it. And when I went through, they were all yes and no. They resulted in this sort of like distribution of answers. Now, there was 2 sort of views, right? Initially, I didn't have this slide that said in this pretty picture, this is what it looks like. It just said, for all these questions that were high risk, you answered, whatever the answer was. You have these, 4 high risk ones, 2 medium risk, and 3 low risk ones. And it just kind of summarized it that way. And the question that was asked was, well, where does that put me, right? So I ended up having to like give them a picture of, well, where in this model am I? People just generally want to know, right? There's curiosity there. So I had to kind of figure out, based on the answers of these questions, if I could map them to this. And there is no mapping. There was no mapping. There was no scoring or mechanism or anything like that basically said, if you answer these questions this way, you're level 2 or level 3 or level 4 or whatever. So there is no linkage between these 2 things necessarily right now. But that would be something that I'm interested in, developing with you as a community to figure out, should there be. But this kind of helped identify that after going through this exercise, there was opportunities in these categories of investment, adoption, and measurement to do something, right? And I think that's the thing that I need to figure out is, now what? But this notion of risk really helped, I think, in terms of motivating some action versus just categorically saying, you're level 2. Okay, so what? Should I do anything? Do I need to do anything? Should I not do anything? I don't know. So when I think about this assessment, it's more about understanding, like, where are you going as a platform, as a product, as a product team, or as a platform engineering team. If you don't have a product orientation, like, where are you going and how do you get there? And it just asks questions, right? So it's not saying that you need to necessarily go do something, but it facilitates that next discussion. Hey, do you have a product manager? Should you have one? Is it the right time to have one, right? Maybe not. So it's really just like more like a way of facilitating the discussion about kind of where you are and then where you're going. So I'll stop here. And
I think we've got three hands backed up, so we'll see if they just to check, if your hand is not directly related to that, like this, like thread of conversation, let's bottom out some of these conversations and we'll come back to new ideas, so you can switch hands or whatever. But Blake, you're up first if it's related.
Yeah, I think so. I think what I'm seeing is there's 2 really measurements we want to have. One is, how do we map ourselves onto the maturity model, which I think is that was really an assessment as to, in the organization, am I at a maturity model that makes sense for my organization? I think the second thing we want to measure is, what is the risk if we don't make changes to our platform initiative? what is the risk to the business and the success of that platform initiative? And I think those are two different assessments. And I think mapping the risk assessment to the risk assessment of the platform initiative to the maturity model, I think is where maybe a lot of the tension is. And that's where I was kind of contentious on some of the things. I think when you separate those two things out and say, I want to measure what is the risk to this platform initiative as it stands right now versus how do I want to measure my maturity on this maturity model? I think those two different uses are very valuable separately, right? Coming from like a purely individual contributor on a platform team, like the risk assessment is very interesting to me and the maturity assessment is very interesting to me. I don't want those two things combined together. I think separating them will be beneficial. And I think both will provide value.
Yeah, William?
Anybody have any feedback on that?
I think Colin had the hand first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, good. Yeah, so we've done a number of these assessments as well with organizations, and that's kind of what I wanted to I think I'm with Corbin on how I perceived the way that the word risk was going to be used here in general. When we do these assessments with an organization, we do both a cloud native maturity assessment based on the cloud native maturity model. Hi, Simon. And we also do a platform maturity assessment. And they both intertwine significantly in many places. In some cases with these organizations, there is a platform team, but there is not a true platform initiative. In some cases, there is like investment, but there is not adoption. Like it's all over the place. And a lot of times it does come back to organizations not actually having an established framework to effectively measure the success of their consumers or whatever else in some mindset. But there are very clear risks that for many of those organizations that can be communicated as a result of like the process we go through and the traits we find by going through the assessment. And so like, while we're not necessarily saying you are at risk at this certain level, I do think it is still okay to say, here are some risks that organizations like yours at these levels like do have or do exhibit. And so I don't want to totally kill the idea of risk. And so I'm kind of backing it up here a little bit. I like that the risk is the different types of risks and the levels are almost quantified, and maybe risk really isn't the right word to use overall, but sometimes you have to use those sales tools even for an internal organization to get the buy-in or adoption that they need to drive forward, and not for fattening the wallets of the consultant that's in there, right? And sometimes risk is the only way to communicate and drive some of that traction or some of those projects that can move the initiative forward or some of those other things. But anyway, just wanted to vocalize that a little bit. I really like how you've got it kind of laid out and quantified here. And I think it does show the difference between your maturity level versus some traits or risks you may exhibit at those levels.
I think I was next. Yeah, Corbin, well, presenting these slides clarified it a little bit for me. And actually what Blake said made a lot of sense. What if we actually are going to keep the risk, but are also going to keep a different way of scoring and scoring the questions? What I mean by that is that a risk assessment makes sense for something, being obviously careful that we don't make like level 1 provisional an all negative thing, because it would be in risk assessment, right? We don't have budget, is private time invested into an initiative that we might or we might not have, therefore it's all red. But what if we actually score as the level the questions? What I mean by that is like, let's take question 1, do you have a dedicated team aligned, blah, 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 blah. If we say no, then instead of giving it a high or a low score as in risk, but we assign it a level, to that question, meaning that each question, not each aspect, but each question would have a level of the maturity model. And growing into the questionnaire, we would have a degree of alignment to a level rather than to another. And we would keep the risk assessment as you presented it for a different report, so that the assessment should generate two reports: one of the effective state of where you are, and another one, as Colin and somehow also Blake mentioned, that what are the things that might present a risk moving forward or moving to the next level. So yes, that's at least how I'm
Yeah, I mean,
seeing.
I think the challenge we have with that aspect, or at least from my experience of going through this exercise, was that we don't want to necessarily say that being in category 4 is the best place to be, right? And that's something that I've heard
Oh.
like pretty loud and clear from this group is, hey, we don't want to just say that. And I agree, like going through this exercise, it was really like if you look at the results here, it's like, hey, out of looking at all this stuff, you're here, and here, like you're kind of, and there's different ways to depict it, right? Like when I was talking to Abby, like we were talking about maybe a spider graph or some other way of like viewing this information, right? But what I wanted to kind of come back with, right, is as I was talking to this team, I was like thinking, okay, regardless of where you are, right, there's these 3 areas are probably the ones that we want to think about a little bit deeper. And we went through the exercise of answering the questions. There were some where they clearly had like a yes, no answer. And there were a few questions where they had some discussion. And when we had the discussion ones, I was like, hey, there's something here that we need to actually come back to and discuss further, because there wasn't like a black and white answer. And I think it goes back to sort of the format of like, yes, no, does that make sense? Is the sort of the reason we went down that path was to make that as simple as possible, right? If you think about surveys, sometimes there's like this five possible answers of like, I strongly agree, I somewhat agree, I'm neutral, I don't really agree. When you have like this range, it's really hard to get agreement, right? And so the idea was, let's make it simple. And then the output is of all the questions, there's maybe 3 areas or 2 areas or 1 area that we should spend time on. And the reality is that it's really just helping that team kind of think about how they're doing, like what are they working on, how could they improve, and how do they take the learnings from other organizations that are doing well, like how do they take those learnings and mature and build up, right, their capabilities. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for that
The
guidance.
problem, Corbin, is that when we make things simple, what I learned throughout the years is that we build a baseline. And when we build a baseline, we are cutting a whole set of the consumers of that baseline out of the picture. So we are making it simple for not even the majority, but just for that baseline that we made it simple for. So I would rather see something that is addressing more than a baseline.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a baseline. It's just I think some of the questions point to, like to your point, like point to level 4, right? Some of them kind of ask categorically, like, hey, if you have this thing, like one example would be like, do you have, like, are you inner sourcing like development of your platform, right? Do you have a community like contributing? And that might be like a really high level of maturity, like within an organization. Not everybody will have that. Maybe not everybody needs that, right? But it would be a question to kind of understand. And that might not be a high risk, right? Your platform initiative isn't going to die if you don't have that thing. So that's probably going to be something like a medium risk thing that, that you can have.
I would also say whenever I introduce this model, the first thing I do is put up a slide that says all models are broken, just some are useful. Like, or something to that effect, because like to the point of like, oh, a baseline isn't quite enough, we'll leave some people behind. Like we just heard from Chris, who's a huge advocate of the maturity model, how he's like, there's aspects of it I can't use, and that's okay. Like there is a very broad world out there, and we do need to clarify like who we're targeting on things and stuff like that. Corbin, do you mind stopping sharing just because it'll be easier to see people's faces? Thank you for sharing your context though, because I think it's helpful to hear like where people have tried. So a few people's hands have come up and come down. I see Marsh still has his hand up. The one thing I want to call out is we've got 9 minutes left for today. This is far from the last time we're going to have a deep dive on this. The thing I would like to do, which I will ask Marsh first because his hand's still raised, is I would like to talk about what next steps are. So Marsh, are you going to open a can of
I have
worms?
a really
like you're about to
short.
say,
No,
or,
I won't. Good question. No, I don't think I will.
I know you too well. I have to ask first.
Yeah, that's right. No, I want to come back to something that William and Corbin touched on in their discussion a couple minutes ago, which is that to me the maturity model in some ways is like a map. You're looking top down at all the possible territories, all the possible journeys you could take, and the question is, where are you trying to go? And where are you on that journey relative to you? It's the difference between looking at Google Maps from the zoomed out view of everything and the turn-by-turn navigation, right? And so I think having this assessment tool helps you keep track of where you are relative to where you think you're going. So I can see these things complementing really nicely.
Agreed.
I don't think I opened a can of worms there.
No, I don't think it. So to be fair, I think it was aligned a little bit with where I'd like for us to be talking about next. So my perception. So again, this is not my project. I'm here to help try and like help us stay on the rails and get to like a published paper, like as a lead who's been through that route before, not as someone who is like, it's my job to write this paper, whatever. But one thing I'm noticing is a trend in all these conversations is there's a lot of, well, the context matters. Well, who we're targeting matters. Well, how we're going to use this matters. And I heard particularly when we were speaking, Colin, you were talking about how to like protect against the consultants or work as a consultant, and Chris spoke about vendor versus end user and all that. And I think that might help us like get to a point of agreement on a way forward, in the sense that then we are at least all pointing at like being able to debate from the same perspective. Hey, these are our target audiences. These are what we want them to get from this. And I don't believe that our current format is going to help us achieve that goal. Versus right now, it's we're sort of debating all of the things all at once. I'm seeing some nods. Is that do people feel like that is a missing piece, something that would help us move forward at this stage?
I personally, Abby, I think that this that we are doing now, just touching a little bit everywhere, it's exactly what is needed at the moment. Just touch all the grounds, get burned there, see what we all nod on, and keep moving. And while we work, focus and drill down on what we understand that is what we want to do. Corbin,
I agree, and that's why I didn't want to be too constraining. Like I jumped in a few times for organization's sake, but basically just wanted us to talk about anything and everything today. So I totally agree, William. Yeah. So I think
I think the question is, as we go forward, like what are some things that I can do to help sort of narrow down on a path? Because I think like when we first started this, I had no idea what this would look like, right? And we had a few discussions, and one was in KubeCon in Paris. And I felt like it was really good, kind of like this, where there was lots of like inputs and things. But then at the end, I felt like I don't know what to go do, right? And I don't want to be stuck in that place where after all this, like I don't know what to go do. I want to make sure that we come away with this, these are the aspects that we think are good. These are aspects we need to work on, so that when we have our next discussion, we aren't just, beating the dead horse, right? So
I think Corbin, from what there is a lot of sentiment, right, on how we are naming things at the moment. There seems to be from risk. Some people want to call it risk. Some people want to call it assessment, whatever. So that's something that we need to work on. I feel personally, and that we should work also on how we what is the source of question, meaning that are we extrapolating questions from the maturity model, or are we getting questions from our experience, from where we see things that organizations most commonly are, and are we mixing the two together? I would love to see that. So I would like to work on that. And we should keep and I should definitely pass the word to Colin. It's the second time that I stopped him. Go on, Colin.
Yeah, mine's really quick too. I think one area that I think would help is spending a little bit of time clarifying what the take homes or outcomes are for the people that take this survey. And I think that might help clarify what some of the expected like deliverables or language, right, are from some of that.
So Abby proposed the next step in the chat, and I was wondering if anybody wanted to try to take ownership of one of those tasks, or I don't want to like.
And you can also counter with something better to do, just to be clear. But that's just a proposal of where I think we're at.
I may be ignorant, but I think that the chat when we close is lost. So wouldn't it be better to have tasks or questions or stuff like that in a GitHub issue or Slack channel?
Happy to add it to the GitHub issue as well. I've moved my running notes that were at the bottom of the doc because we were also informative and detailed. I moved them into a proper document because I suspect we're gonna have more of these. That document is editable by everyone, just like the typical platform working group meeting documents are. And I would add the action item there and would also reference it in the Google, the GitHub issue if that's useful. But I guess the question from Corbin is like, so the question from me is, does this make sense as a next step? And the question from Corbin is, does anybody want to take a stab at that? If it makes sense, does anyone want to take a stab at that in the next, like, I don't know, few days? So like by the end of the weekend-ish, so we have a week to have a look at what people think, what the proposal is, have some comments asynchronous, and maybe find some time to do another one of these calls if it lends itself well to that.
Yeah, Corbin, I'm going through one of these right now, like deliverables in the next few days anyway. Would love to run through some of the in situ stuff that you have and just apply it and practice it. Got a ton of information, but don't know if you have time, but would love to follow up with you today or tomorrow and see what you got.
Yeah, definitely.
I think I can help with the outcome after that. Sorry.
Yeah, there you are, Steve. Yes. Again, it's not ever going to be one person's thing, but I always find that it's really nice to have someone who like can try and take what they heard and put this into words. So those that were a part of the maturity model will remember the time when everybody put in their own maturity model. There was like 6 of them after a couple weeks of thinking about it. And then I took all 6 of them and I resulted in an outcome that I thought balanced the conversation about the 6 and the 6 proposals into what is basically the final model now, or pretty close to it. So that sort of consolidation of the information as an attempt to try and get alignment is a really effective part of this process, I think. So
sorry, one R with a hand up. I don't know.
Yes, is that Rodney in there? Or a different R?
Yes, it's me.
Yes, hi Rodney. Can't hide if you raise your hand. Go on.
Okay. Sorry, I don't have much to really contribute to the conversation. It's just that for me, just flagging a few things because as you mentioned, Abby, earlier about sort of like we're approaching the conversation from many different angles, and one of the angles I think that I noticed is like someone from like from vendors, right? So how are we keeping our biases in check just to make sure that, you know, like once we come up with something, you know, like we have a white paper, we're not really pushing something, right? Like we're not trying to sell something, but we're really more. And I'm asking this because this is the first time I'm kind of like being part of this community where we're writing. Is it just, you know, the fact that we are operating in a community is that good enough to check those biases that we're coming, we have different backgrounds? Is that good enough? Just
It's a very good question. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at the call right now, and there are a mix of, from what I can tell, consultants and vendors. Do we have any end users left? Some of you, I don't know what you do. So raise your hand if you're an end user. We had end users earlier. Oh, Colin. Colin. We had end users on the call earlier today. And so I think like you asking that question, and you're an end user, I know what you do. Like we have end users, we have consultants, and we have vendors, and it's that, honestly, I think it's that trifecta that actually makes for the best possible outcomes, but it's also why we all have to keep each other honest, and why we have these calls where we can really debate things out with like honesty, with respect, and like with depth, right? So basically keep asking exactly that, and keep gut checking as much as possible, and asking people to gut check. So that's all we can do, really.
Just
yeah. And also, if you do ever feel like we're not keeping it in check, you can back channel to anybody in this group that you feel like could challenge it if you don't want to challenge it yourself in the larger group, because it can be a lot, and make sure that it gets challenged. So myself and Colin are both working group leads. Corbin is like an advocate for this piece of work. Like Simon is a lead in other working groups. Like a lot of us have experience of like sort of challenging in these larger groups, and are happy to. So this is true for everyone, not just Rodney. If you ever feel like this is ever going sideways, or voices aren't being heard, or whatever, feel free, and you don't feel comfortable bringing that up, please do back channel to somebody. We will take care of it. We have a code of conduct. We want to live by it. That's important. So
cool.
Yeah. All right. So I am trying to write up the ask to you, Steve. Steve might have popped off already, to Steve to do this. And then but I think the goal is sort of in the next few days, hopefully by the end of the weekend, maybe Steve will be able to share something with us, and we'll be able to async chat about it, and then hopefully get on a call if we need to after that. So thank you all. Any feedback on first deep dive, please shout. It's the first of, I'm sure, many. And thank you to everyone who came.
Let's have them more often.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all. Appreciate the feedback.
Thank you, Corbin. Thank you very
Great
much.
discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.